Well, thank you guys for joining us or joining me and joining us this morning here on a Saturday to talk about online classes. I know this is, not something we really want to be talking about, but of course, this is where we are given our state. So, what we'll be going through today is just some things to think about, some tips to look at on the pedagogical side, and then of course on a little bit on the tech side as well. And then I know several of you sent in questions, so if I don't touch base on your questions during the conversation, please do put them in the chat box, and then we'll have time at the end, and I'll go through the questions that were pre-submitted, as well as any others that you have along the way. So let me start off by introducing myself. My name is Rebecca Bush, and I've been in the world of education for quite a while now. I was a classroom teacher, a primary classroom teacher for a long time, and then along the way I have specialized to now be a reading specialist and dyslexia and academic language therapist. So really I've spent a lot of time working with kids, studying how best to teach kids, particularly within the fields of literacy, language, and special education. All right, so let's get started. Of course, we're here from Baker and Bloom. We're all at home actually, but Baker and Bloom is an education center located in Admiralty. We are pre-K through grade 12, so all ages, and all of the classes come down to this four-leaf approach. So these are the four areas that Baker and Bloom is targeted as being really important for all of our learners, no matter their age or stage, but these are the things that we want to look at. And our classes are all evolved around this idea of creative literacy. And I like to define creative literacy as having the flexibility to think outside the box, to approach any problem, come up with a solution, and then have the skills to be able to explain what you did and how you got there. We do have the Inspired Reader and Writer program, which is our cornerstone program within the primary program, kind of designed as a one-stop shop for literacy, language, and most important, those critical thinking and creative thinking skills. Of course, we do also have other classes. There's the IRW, as well as creative writing, public speaking, STEM, Chinese, and then of course we have some of the more kind of traditional classes as well, which might be test prep or admissions prep, as well as academic coaching, which is that one-on-one approach. So let's get started. So we are here today to talk about how to make the most of online classes. So as I said, as we go through, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box. And if I don't answer them throughout the presentation, we'll stop and take questions at the end as well. So let's first talk about what everyone's roles are, right? So I always like to think of us sort of as a triangle. You've got your kids, and then we've got you as the parents, and then us as the educators. So let's talk about what everyone's roles are. So first of all, us as teachers, our role is to, first of all, meet learners where they are. So really thinking about where each kid is along the different developmental continua, and then help teach them what they need to know, and then also inspire them along the way. We also want to do what we can to connect with learners. So you'll see, particularly as we have gotten a little bit better at this online teaching, we might use different materials, use different apps or games to motivate the kids, engage them, keep them excited. We also want to be really clear with you guys as parents and caregivers, so that we are giving those clear instructions, we're sharing resources, everything that we need to help you guys set up that home learning environment. And of course, providing regular feedback. So not only to our students, but to the parents as well. So where you're getting feedback from the teacher as how things are going, what they need to be working on, attendance even, are they logged in, how engaged are they? All of that feedback should be flowing from the teachers. And then of course we want to plan meaningful lessons that, again, like I was saying, meet those kids right where they are and then move them along. So let's talk about the kids, right? The important learners. So with our learners, what we want to do is really give them the space and the support to kind of remain motivated and excited and to always try their best. And so we want to do that through lots of positive praise, through clear expectations as well, but giving them the space and the support to be who they are. We want our learners to make sure that they work positively and respectfully with teachers and classmates. So having, again, those clear expectations around what's expected through a Zoom class or Google Meet, and how they'll be interacting with each other, what kind of language is appropriate, and what that should be looking like. Of course, attendance is important, right? If they're not there, we can't teach them. So making sure that, and this is where it gets a little tricky, especially with those younger kids, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. I know you guys sent in some questions about some younger learners and online learning. But the thing with online learning is we really want to take the opportunity to build the resilience and build the independence in our learners, much more so than they might even have during being on campus and being in a live class or an in-person class. The onus of the learning really does come back on them. Now, of course, with our younger learners, that does become a little bit trickier because they're developmentally not ready for that yet. And we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end when we take questions. But really starting even in first and second grade, within what's realistically expected, they can be there and starting to take responsibility for their learning. Right? So we want them to be responsible for their learning. So they are not passive participants in this experience. They need to be responsible for their learning. So even working with 6-year-olds, the first thing I say to them is, are we ready to learn? Do you have your materials? And it puts it on them to be responsible. And of course, we want our kids to share their thoughts and feelings. I think particularly, during these times where some of us are, some kids might be struggling with not having that social time, not having the play time. We want those thoughts and feelings to be able to come out in positive and supportive ways. And then, of course, to do their work. And this is where you guys as parents, with that clear communication from the teachers, know what to follow up with on the kids. Whether it's through Class Dojo or Seesaw or whatever format the school might be using. All right, so now let's talk about you guys as parents and caregivers. So to really focus on I keep using this word positive, right? We want to use this positive growth mindset language with your children. And so that means that, a growth mindset is that, well, I can't do it yet. I struggled at this, I didn't succeed at this, but this is what I worked really hard at. This is what I did do well. Here are the things that I'm going to keep going on. So this idea that the skills we have, the knowledge we have, it's forever growing and expanding. So we want to encourage that thinking with our children. So when you come across, a bump in the road, we don't let it stop us completely. We try to get over it. And even if we can't quite get over it yet, we've learned so many skills along the way about how to persevere and how to work through those things. So this is a big one, and we'll talk a little bit specifically about how to set up the home learning environment in a different slide. But for you guys as parents and caregivers, to give the kids everything they need to be prepared. So even high schoolers, they're not really developmentally mature enough yet, and as far as their brain development, their cognitive development, to be able to do everything completely by themselves. Now, some kids are maturing at different rates. Some of them might have that independence, but particularly when we start talking about using devices, our kids' brains just aren't developed enough yet to be able to do it completely by themselves. So having that class schedule printed out on the table with them, having a consistent place where they're always coming to work, where they've got all of their materials, every notebook that they need, paper, pencil, whatever it is they're going to use is already there for them. You can also use timers and things like that. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about this later on, but really helping your child be set up for success. And of course, monitor their engagement and progress. So as they're going through these classes, just keep touch with them. Look at the work that they've done at the end of the day. And that's not to say that you are going to, check it or grade it, but just to see that it's done, checking whatever platform your school is using as well. And also just asking, what they did today, asking the questions. And, I know a lot of times kids come home and we ask them what happened that day, and they're like, well, I don't know, I don't remember. But because you then have so much more of the resources there with you, you can ask specific questions about what they did in the classes and how things went. And this is a big one. If there's ever any concern or issues or anything that arise, you always want to make sure that you go to your classroom teacher first. They're going to be your first port of call for any questions that you have. Even if it's something that you've noticed, or even if you don't think it maybe is a concern, you can raise it and then go from there. And now this is the other big one. We want to set our kids up for success, and we want to be there to support them, but we also need to be able to step back and let them do it by themselves. And now, if that means that they don't know how to do that math problem or don't know how to spell that word, we can guide them through it. We're not just going to give them the answer, but we want to set them up for success. Of course, this is, a big one. Be aware of background noise during live sessions. So, I know Hong Kong apartments are small. Sometimes we don't always have that capacity to be in a quiet room. But we also want to make sure that sometimes I have kids on live sessions and there's a billion other things going on in the room around them and they can barely even hear what I'm saying. So we want to give them, again, the best chance to be successful. And again, to keep those open, respectful lines of communication. So I always like to think of us as a triangle. So us as the teachers, you guys as the parents and caregivers, and then of course our kids, where we are sort of communicating all between them. Yeah, okay. And the other big thing, of course, is to maintain that well-being and development. And I know this is a little tricky right now because even playgrounds are shut, but we really want to make sure that we're looking at that whole child. So some of the things that I've noticed a lot, particularly as we sort of continued into online learning, that schedule and those routines, of course, aren't in place. So even things as far as snacks, kids shouldn't really be eating a snack or eating their lunch during the session. We want to try to keep their schedule as routine as possible, just like we would with a school day. Schedules and routines are really important for kids, for any age, but particularly when we're talking about, those early years and primary years. And staying physically active as well. We're actually starting to see some sort of anecdotal research coming out that for some of our kids, their physical well-being is deteriorating. So we want to make sure that we really keep that up as well. So follow a daily schedule. So we're creatures of habit. We like to know what's coming up. And kids are very much the same. They really don't do well in constantly fluctuating environments because, again, their brains just aren't developed to that point yet. So if we think about a regular school day, they get up at this time, they get dressed at this time, they have breakfast, everything's very scheduled. So with that home learning environment, as much as possible, you want to try to stick to something similar. Again, building in those routines and responsibilities. So even them getting ready in the morning, maybe you guys have worked together and you make a little checklist or little pictures and that's posted up. So you can say, all right, it's time for your morning routine, and they know what that means. Yeah, and this is a big one. And I know that social interaction is a little tricky right now. And this is where, with even a little bit older kids, by the time they get to even a 6 or 7, having short little bursts of even shared Google Meets between friends where they can just sit and chat, even that can be really important. And that physical movement is also really important because I said we are starting to see research showing that their physical development is being negatively impacted. Yeah, and again, here's those regular meal times and, of course, lots of time to sleep. We all know that we need to be sleeping a lot, but for those of you who have secondary students, high school students, depending on their age, sometimes they even need to be sleeping as much as 10, 11, 12 hours a night. Now, I know sometimes with school schedules that can be tricky, but it's just important to keep that in mind, that we really do need sufficient sleep time in order for our brains to develop appropriately. And again, that designated workspace, so as quiet an area as possible, having that one place where they always are, having all of their materials out. So kids, they really are environmentally impacted. And that's to say that the way that they act, particularly when we're talking about kind of 8-year-olds and under, is very situational. So we always hear that, they act differently at school than they do at home. And that's because that's how their brains work. They don't have that cognitive flexibility yet to understand how to act in different areas or how to act in different ways in the same place, I guess I should say. So as much as possible, you want to kind of create a mini school at home where, okay, this is the place where we're going to have school. This is where we do that. And again, I know Hong Kong apartments are really small, so it might even just be, that one corner of their room where there's the little table and their things. And really the only time that they sit at that little area is when they have their classes. All right, so just a few little tips on how you can support your child. Yeah, so like I was saying, well-being is really important. So the first thing is all feelings are okay. So we have this huge range of feelings and emotions as human beings, and it's okay to experience all of them. We want to acknowledge them and support them. Help your child with emotional regulation. This is really important, and this is where, again, with online learning, we start to open up the door more for video games and online gaming. Which is a whole separate discussion, but just for you guys as parents, it's something to be really, really aware of, because there are a lot of very negative impacts. Sometimes for even playing 10, 20 minutes of video games a day, in impacting the part of the brain that supports emotional regulation. Again, those routines are really important. Even having them wear their uniform to go to school, still go to school is really important as well. Yeah, and lots of movement, that gross motor development. Even if you are trying to stay inside, you can do lots of stretching and dancing. There's fun videos online that you can do as well, just to get the kids up and moving. And the biggest thing, with parents, and this is where I say this to all the parents, and this line becomes a little bit harder with online learning. At the end of the day, you have to remember that you are their parent. You're not their teacher, you're not their tutor, you're not their taskmaster. And so whenever kids are struggling for whatever reason, we need to focus on that relationship first. You have to maintain that positive relationship as their parent, because that's the support that they need from you the most. So talking about our Inspired Reader and Writer program, which I told you about earlier. So you can have those regular conversations with your child about really anything and everything. So one of the big things that impacts on down the line their reading development is their language development. So the more we can just talk to our kids about everything, the better prepared they will be, both on the language side and then eventually on the reading side as well. We'll talk a little bit more specifically about reading later on in the talk, but reading is really, really important. So both that independent and that shared reading time. So depending on their age, it does shift. But really by the end of first grade, we're looking to have about 20 minutes of sustained independent reading. So that is to say that they're sitting down with books, reading for that entire time. Now building up to that, that's not necessarily to say that they're actually reading the book. They might just be looking at the pictures or making up the story, but we're building that independence and we're building that stamina around it. And again, that shared reading time is really, really important. So even with secondary students, college students, if they're able to still listen to, you reading to them, it's really important to be able to listen to that expert reader. And that doesn't have to be in any specific language, because we, as readers, we use the same thinking skills no matter what language we're reading in. So we think about what's going to happen, we think about who the characters are, all of that can be developed in any language. So yeah, again, that resilience is really, really important. So we want to value the process and not the product. So that goes back to that growth mindset. It's the road to get there is more important than crossing the finish line. And this is a big one where you can, going back to that daily routine, have that family reading time. So with kids, particularly if they're struggling to read or they're not interested in reading, to just say, oh, go sit down in the corner and read a book, they're not really going to do it. But if we all sit down together, as a class, whether that's online or in person, or certainly as a family, and we set a timer together and we're all reading together, those kids feel more supported in completing that. To talk a little bit about the STEM classes, or for those of you looking to kind of boost some more of the math skills, first of all, math is everywhere. Even as you're walking up the stairs, you can count them. You can cook together. There's tons of math and cooking. You're making cookies and you want to double the recipe. There's multiplication. There's all kinds of math you can do. Lots of games that you can do to build critical thinking skills. Puzzles are really great. It also helps support working memory and that memory side of things as well. And again, independence and creativity really, really important. And I know sometimes it is hard if we're in smaller, in smaller apartments, things like that. But giving kids unstructured time gives them the opportunity to build their creativity. When we're bored, that's when we become creative. And then, yeah, so using that range of strategies to think and solve. I mean, even something as, if you're going to go get the bus, you can pull up the map and have them tell you which bus route to take. If you go and you see we can take this, and this bus, have them go look at the thing to find the times. All right, so you can use these sort of daily routines to build those thinking skills. And then, yeah, the more materials we have for them to just build and play, again, that's where that creativity can really come in play. So just to kind of wrap some of that up, creating that schedule is really important. Write it down, use a timer or a clock, be consistent. So have that same workspace, have the materials ready, make it as quiet as possible, and have it be sort of that designated learning time, and then help them be responsible. So checklists are really great. Kids don't yet necessarily have the cognitive development to keep that whole to-do list in their brains. To be honest, sometimes as adults we don't either, particularly when there's so much going on. So help them make that checklist of what they're supposed to do each day or each part of the day, and then go through the messages from the teacher, go through Seesaw or whatever it might be together. Of course, the big thing, praise their efforts and stay positive. So on the tech side, every school and Baker and Bloom as well is using slightly different things. So just make sure you know what the different platforms are. And then when it comes to devices, if you're using school devices, as in devices that are remotely controlled by the school, it is possible to lock different parts of those during different times. You can also have parental controls where you're setting timers on the apps. You can also just delete apps or limit the content. You can also physically lock up the device, as in, yep, school's over, we're taking the computer and we're locking it in the cabinet. Because sometimes, particularly, even as adults we feel this, but definitely with kids, there's that out of sight, out of mind. So if you're finding that it's a struggle to get them off the device when they're not supposed to be on it, just remove it and make that part of your schedule and say, all right, school's over, it's 3:30, the devices are going in the cabinet. All right, so to talk a little bit about reading, which is kind of my reading, my specialty as a reading specialist, because we got a few questions about reading, but I think one of the big things we can do, particularly for kids who were struggling a little bit with staying engaged with the online classes, is you can take a step back from kind of what's happening at school and really focus on what's actually important. And that, of course, really depends on the age and stage. But at the end of the day, particularly with their younger kids, if they're not able to sit through a longer class, you want to think about what that class is about and then sort of target those skills. So one thing you can do, for example, is really focus on language development. And now that can be whatever language it is. With our kids, we also want to really focus on their mother language. Because what we don't want to happen is that we end up with learners where none of their languages are really that strong. So whatever language you're speaking at home, it's okay to do everything in that language. You can have conversations. You can even talk about the work that they're doing at school in that language. Don't ever feel as parents that you need to swap languages just to focus on one or the other, because we want to make sure that they have that one language that's really strong and that they're building that critical thinking, that world knowledge, vocabulary, all of those important things through that one language. The other big thing, of course, is reading and literacy development. So one of the big things with reading and literacy development, as I said earlier, is that it really is focused on language. The language comes first. Speaking and listening, and of course, if sort of cognitive differences aside, but speaking and listening are naturally developing skills. those they're going to develop. So we want to strengthen those as much as possible because we can start developing those really from the second they're born. So the stronger their language base is, the better it will support their reading first, and then on down the line their writing. Because reading always comes first. Reading and writing go hand in hand, but reading always comes first. You can also just be reading with them. So a huge part of the learning to read process is working, basically working with expert readers, a parent, a teacher, whoever that might be, and listening to them read. This is what it sounds like to be a fluent reader. These are the kinds of questions I ask myself as I'm reading. You finish a page, let's stop and talk about it. What happened on that page? There's all these different questions you can do with them. Yeah. So then just a few kind of obvious tech tips, and I know we're getting some questions in, so I'm going to finish up the slides and then we'll take the rest of the questions. I think at this point we kind of know a lot of this, but if you can use those laptops or desktops or tablets, it really just depends on the age of the kid as well. Make sure you've got the speed, the internet, all of that. Of course, make sure the device is plugged in. I cannot tell you how many times I've had kids be like, oh, my iPad's running out of battery, and then they leave the class. So just make sure they're prepared and ready to go. So thank you for joining us. And you, of course, can also join our classes for the spring and summer, for those of you who are on summer break now, and then for those of you who will have summer break on later. But I'm going to stop here and start to go through all of the different questions that we had. So I'll start with some of the questions that you guys sent in, and then, of course, those questions that have been popping up in the chat box as well. So there were a lot of questions about focusing during classes. So I think, first of all, we need to remember that even as adults, focusing and paying attention to someone for more than even 10, 20 minutes can be really, really hard. And particularly when we start talking about doing it through a Zoom, our eyes get tired, our brain gets tired. So we first have to keep in mind that staying actively engaged during an online class is really difficult. I think particularly as we go farther into this, a lot of us are just kind of, the kids in particular, they want to go back to school. They're tired of listening to all of this. But so some of the things you can really do. So first of all, have that understanding of what is a realistic expectation. So a realistic expectation to actively be listening is really 1 to 2, maybe 3 minutes per year. And that is to say that they're sitting and they're really listening to what's happening. Now they can stop and listen to what's happening and then, write something on their whiteboard. They can stay engaged when the topic or when the task is shifting like that. But to just sit and listen to somebody talking, it really is about 1 or 2 minutes per year. So that's to say if they're 6, you can get like 6 to really 10 or 12 minutes of active listening. And so that's where it's really important for us as teachers to keep it changing. So it's never just me sitting and talking. We might watch a video and then we write some things on our whiteboards and then we get up and move around and then we come back and listen to me. So trying to keep it really chunked and moving. You can also, so first of all, having those realistic expectations, and that's where that schedule is really important and having that timer. So particularly for younger kids, even takes until they're about 8 years old to fully grasp this concept of time. So if you say your class is 10 minutes, get that kitchen timer and set it, and they can see, okay, I'm going to sit here and listen to this for 10 minutes. Now, of course, a lot of these classes are longer than that, so that's where you can work with the teachers to make sure that they are getting up and moving around. You can also just have them stand up and listen for a little bit. They don't have to be sitting and listening the whole time. But I also think at the end of the day, we do have to be realistic that particularly with our younger kids, it's really hard to stay engaged through a screen. So we just want to be really clear with our expectations, give them those brain breaks as often as possible, and then keep the classes, not that the classes need to have bells and whistles or anything like that, but that we are changing up what we're doing every couple minutes. We had a lot of questions as well about reading. So I guess before we move into the reading side, are there any other questions kind of about helping kids focus during the online classes? Yeah. Yeah, so there was a question that just came through about managing their online use. Um, and that this is a tricky one because there really is there's no good answer to it. And a huge part of that, so the question was about managing online game time, YouTube surfing, stuff like that. And that's because the way the brain develops for our kids, and even, I mean, this even for secondary students, particularly for, some kids, boys, and, boys do develop more slowly, or those who might have any sort of attention or behavioral issues. It can even be until they're like 25, late 20s, where they fully have the ability to stop and think about how long they've been doing something and whether it's a good choice to continue or not. So when we're talking about primary age kids, they really just don't have the brain capacity yet to say, oh, I've been doing this too long, I need to stop and do something else. And then when we add in the fact that games are designed to be addictive, that YouTube is designed to be watched and watched and watched endlessly, it's almost impossible sometimes for kids to stop and do something else. So what we can do is, first of all, set those really clear expectations, have that scheduled in place. And then as far as reinforcing it, sometimes even just, like I said, physically taking the devices away, locking them up, limiting the kinds of apps that they have on there. Computers are a little bit different, but I know with iPads, you can lock the app, you can delete the app, you can, only have YouTube for kids. There are things that you can do as a parent. You can put parental controls in place. And then again, just using timers. You could even just kind of have a conversation with them and be like, all right, you're going to play the video games, and I'm just going to see how long it is. Or even if you don't sort of warn them that doing it, when they start playing, just kind of start a timer. And then you can stop them and say, hey, do you realize that you just spent an hour playing a video game? Let's talk about that. What do you think? Do you think that's a good choice? What else could we be doing? And kind of get their buy-in and start to build their understanding around it as well. So one question just came up about a 3.5-year-old sitting through a Zoom class. I completely understand where you're coming from. 3-year-olds are not designed to sit and listen through a screen. They're not. So if we think about how their school functions as a 3-year-old, they're playing, they're running around, they're moving different tables, they're talking, they're doing all these different things. That's how they're designed, right? They're not designed to sit and listen. So first of all, I think it's totally normal that he doesn't want to sit and watch TV, and I think, or watch a Zoom class, and I think it's actually a really good thing. So this is where you kind of have to, as a parent, stop and think, okay, well, what really is the point of these Zoom classes? What is, and this is where obviously that communication with teachers is really important as well. What are we trying to get out of this class? How can I support that in a different way? And can I kind of change my expectations a little bit as well? And then that's where you also need to work with the school. Obviously they have attendance requirements and things like that. But it really is totally normal that he doesn't want to sit and watch, or listen to his Zoom class. So that's where you just kind of have to work with the school as well. And then just have those really clear expectations and maybe reduce the time, chunk it a lot more where he's able to do this and then go do something else. So another question just came in about YouTube as sort of a learning tool versus, attention span. So even as a teacher in schools and in the Baker and Bloom classes, we play videos. We do, because oftentimes a video can explain something far better than we can. That's what they're for. But we watch that one video and then we stop and we talk about it. So you definitely can use YouTube to your advantage to learn about the world, to try different experiments, all of that. But what we want to try to limit is that just continuous, just sort of going on and on and on and on, right? So it's that, and that, again, that's how YouTube is designed. Like that one video plays, the next one immediately pops up, then there's the ad, there's all these things in there to keep you engaged. So you can sort of set it as okay, we're going to watch this one video to learn something, or even these two videos, or maybe even there's just one channel, right? We're going to watch this one YouTube channel and we're not going to watch anything else. So yeah, so to kind of switch gears a little bit into the language side, we had a couple of questions about language. So one of them was talking about, which I think, everyone in Hong Kong is sort of living in this environment that parents speak one language, they're learning another one at school, and then oftentimes the aunties might be speaking a different language. So for that, so first of all, it's about the age. So when they're really up until about the age of 6 or 7, that's when they have the capacity to learn a language and sound like a native speaker. That doesn't mean that they need to be totally fluent in that language, but they need to be speaking it enough that they're able to hear and produce the sounds that are unique to that language. Because by the time they get to, the window starts to close about 5, and then by the time they're at 7, I mean, as an adult, I can learn Russian and I can become totally fluent, but I will never sound like a Russian because my brain has lost the ability to make those sounds that are unique to that language. So you want to think about what languages you want to expose them to and just get them speaking. So it's okay to be, to have all of these different languages. When you're talking about little kids, really 3 and under, as much as possible, you want to think about having ideally kind of one situation or one parent speak one language or the other so that the brain kind of starts to compartmentalize these languages. I know we code switch all the time. I mean, I grew up speaking 3 languages as well, and we kind of mixed them around. But as much as possible, you want to try to avoid that so that they're kind of getting more of a engrossed method, engrossed time with that one language. And now, of course, once they start getting older, it's totally okay to go back and forth. But really up until even 2 or 3, you want to try to keep it clear as to who's teaching what. So I think the question was for those of you who are not native speakers of that language, but you want to expose your child to that language. I think it's totally fine, to be teaching that. But I do think you also want to think about at least giving them some exposure with native speakers of that language so that then they're also, like I said, hearing those sounds and producing those sounds. So it's totally okay if they're listening to people who are not native speakers and building that understanding of that language, but try to balance that with also having some time with native speakers. So one question just came in about sort of preference of language. Yeah, that's totally common. And I think sometimes what we see is, with different languages is for whatever reasons the kids might have kind of come up with a different sort of bias or an understanding of that language. Maybe they have that class at school and they really don't like that class, so then they're like, well, I don't want to speak that. It might be that it's a little bit harder for them. So it's totally okay for them to have one language or the other that they prefer. And that's very normal, that we're always going to be more comfortable in one language or the other. But you do want to try to continue to support both languages. So again, that talk about switching languages, I think it's important for parents to keep talking in the language that they've been talking in, continue to build that development and understanding. So I think some things that you could do is just kind of make it fun. And, you're not going to force him necessarily to respond to you in that one language, but if you continue to speak to him in his mother tongue, and you can be playing games, you can, watch fun little cartoons, you can do fun things to kind of bring it back into his native, or into his regular life. But I think also, sometimes, particularly with 2-year-olds, like they kind of just have mood swings at the time. So it could just be sort of a phase he's going through. So I would say just keep going with speaking it and see how it goes. So to kind of move into the side of reading. So this isn't necessarily a talk about reading, but I love it. It's one of my passions, so I'm happy to answer all of your questions that came through. So first of all, I think to sort of foster a love of independent reading, it really comes down to that sort of making it part of your family culture. Um, so having, like I said, having that family time, having books around where we're all sitting down and reading, and then just giving them the time to grow into that as well. Um, First of all, learning to read there's definitely that bell curve, right? Some kids, they're going to take a little bit longer to learn to read. They might need more targeted instruction, but we can make sure that we continue to foster this love of books. We can share books together as a family, and then sort of slowly build up that independent time, right? If you're gonna run a marathon, you're not just gonna walk out tomorrow morning and go run a marathon. So if we consider 30 minutes of sustained reading as our marathon, we might do 5 minutes. We do that for a few days, and you can make a little chart like, oh, we did 5 minutes, that was great. Now we're going to try for 10 minutes and kind of build them up towards it. And again, sitting and reading with them. Let's see. And then some of the other questions were about sort of phonics and when to start to learn different things. Yeah. So yeah, starting to move into some of the phonics. Thank you for that question again. So if we think about reading development, and again, we could sit here and talk about this for a very long time, but to kind of give you a quick summary, language comes first. So that language development is really, really important. So actually the listening is the first thing we develop, then the speaking, then the reading, then the writing. And even as all of those strengthen, they all strengthen sort of in tandem. So we cannot improve our writing without improving our reading and our listening and speaking. They all have to go up together. So that's kind of the first thing to think about. The next thing is then to actually start to teach them how to read. And we first need to remember that reading and writing are not naturally occurring human phenomenons. These are things that humans, as a society, we have developed over the last couple thousand years to come up with this code. It really is a code. It's a bunch of random marks on a page that we decided mean something. We need to learn how to break that code. And in order to do that, we actually use several different parts of our brain working in conjunction to read the word on the page and then, of course, write the word on the page. So phonics is really, really important. The precursor to what part of phonics that you kind of start first and then also runs along when you start phonics is what's called phonological awareness, which is rhyming, breaking apart words, putting them together, which is why we teach nursery rhymes to kids. It helps them build this understanding of sort of the rhythm of language, how to play with the different chunks of language. So rhyming books for really any age, but particularly sort of 7 and under are really, really important. So then kind of moving into actually learning how to read. So when we learn how to read, phonics is the first step. We want to be teaching them how to break apart the word and first sound it out, letter by letter, and then starting to recognize the chunks of letters like TH, for example, and then the parts of the word, the ing at the end, things that we're not always sounding out. But we always want to say that reading is reading, not guessing. We look at every letter on the page and then we read. So the more times we read that word, we start to build what's called our orthographic memory. So if I say the word cat, for example, I can see that CAT pop up into my head. I can hear the meow. I can see the picture of a cat. All of those pieces have come together. And the way that we get there is that we accurately read and understand that word multiple times. Now that could be 3 or 4 or 5 times for some kids. That could be 20 to 30 times for some kids. But they need to read that word and understand it multiple times, and then it's in their brain and they're no longer sounding it out. So just like us as adults, when we read, unless it's biology textbook, we don't really have to stop and break apart words. We're able to just read. But then running alongside that understanding of breaking apart and sounding out words is looking at sort of those sight words or the camera words, high frequency words. Different people, different programs call them different things. And those are the ones that don't always fit the pattern. And so those are the ones that we kind of to some extent just have to memorize. Now, those words that the group of words that we actually just have to memorize is actually really, really small if we think about it. But sometimes what we see with the younger kids is actually the shorter the word, the more common the word, sometimes the more irregular the spelling. And that's because of the history of where those words came from. So I guess all of this to say, to sort of answer your question, is the first strategy needs to be to look at the letters on the page and break it apart. We want that to always be their go-to strategy, because what we don't want is for them to read the first couple letters and then guess the word, because reading's not guessing. But what we can do is use repeated reading, so read the same text again and again, sometimes use flashcards, where they're able to just read the word. So yeah, it really is kind of a balance, but you do want to be building that breaking apart and reading first. So the next question was about comics. Definitely get this question a lot. I think the first thing we want to think about is, well, there's several pieces to this. So first of all, reading is really, really hard for most kids. I mean, there are those couple of kids that can just pick up a book and they kind of teach themselves to read, but that's actually a very small portion of our population. You have to think about that bell curve again. So for a lot of kids, particularly until they become fluent readers, which if we look at brain development, oftentimes doesn't happen until really second or third grade. So you're looking at, sort of 8, 9 years old is when they actually are becoming fluent readers. Prior to that, they're still kind of learning how to read, and reading is still really hard. So that's the one thing to remember. The second thing is we can look at the kinds of comics that they're reading. And this is where we sort of bridge over into, graphic novels. Graphic novels really are fantastic. They're engaging for kids. The photos are there to help support understanding, so they're a little bit easier for kids to read, but they still are building a lot of the same skills that we want out of reading. They're learning new words. They're focusing on a story. They're seeing how that story develops over different parts. They're thinking about it. So comics and graphic novels, totally okay. What we can do is actually look at the comics and the graphic novels that they're reading. And make sure that they're ones that have a robust vocabulary, that have an interesting story, that kind of have more going on to it. So kind of continuing on with that Phonics Continuum. So first of all, we have to think about, and this is a trend that's happening all over the world, I think Hong Kong more than other places. Oftentimes the reading and writing expectations from schools is 1, 2, sometimes even 3 years beyond what it should be. And that's to say that, some K3 students are expected to learn vowel pairs, which is something that we should be looking at really in second grade. So we do really have to keep that in mind. So again, if we kind of think about the ages and stages, and every kid's totally different. Some kids are ready to start reading earlier. Some kids need more time. But they really shouldn't be starting to put together letters and sounds to make words developmentally until even like end of K3. So kind of 5 going on 6. 6 is usually when we kind of see that it's starting to click and they really are kind of reading a little bit more. So I think it's okay to not, think so much about what's going on in some of the schools. I think particularly some of the kindergartens really do kind of rush through the phonics way too quickly, and they oftentimes just end up confusing kids. So it's okay to kind of take a step back and really just look at what's developmentally appropriate as well. So I know there's that question about dyslexia. I'll get to that in a second. But just to touch base on that, them reading versus you reading, it really is, even once they're fluent readers, it still can be you reading to them most of the time, because they're getting so much more knowledge because they're listening to books that they can't read yet, right? So they're getting the vocabulary, they're getting the world knowledge, they're getting all of this great stuff from you reading to them. But what you can start to do is share the reading, so words on the page that they'll be able to read. They read a sentence, you read the rest of the page. They read one page, you read one page. You can kind of share the reading, but also keeping in mind that that story time together is really important. So you don't ever want that to be, it's not homework, it's not a chore, it's something that you're enjoying. So if they're really tired that day, just read to them. Or if it's a little bit harder book, read to them. But maybe just ask them to read a few words here and there. And then to talk about this question of dyslexia. So there are some signs that we can see really about 3.5 to 4. The first signs that we see pop up have to do with language. So they struggle to get the word out sometimes, or they swap the parts of the word around, or they swap words that are very similar. So saying volcano instead of tornado, for example. They're using thing a lot instead of being able to identify the concrete noun for cup, table, things like that. So that first step is language. The next step that we see, which usually comes out about 4, is when kids are able to start rhyming. So if we're singing nursery rhymes, if we're doing all of that, and they just don't get it, that's sort of the next phase that we look for. By the time they're about 4.5, they should be able to rhyme. So then this question about reversals, the D and the B, the F and the T, it's totally normal. And that again is because writing really is these sort of random sticks and dots and circles that we stuck together and put on a page, and hey, they're supposed to mean something. If I were to take a chair and turn it any which way, it's still a chair. But for some reason, if I take, a circle and a stick, it can be 4 different letters with totally different sounds. So that reversal is totally normal, even until about 6.5. It can be totally normal to see that. But what we want to see, first of all, if I show them a D and a B, can they see the difference? If they write a D instead of a B and then I write a D, does yours look like mine? Can they tell the difference? Can they hear the difference between the sounds? That's the other big one. Can they hear the difference between a D and a B? And they're just mixing up the picture of it. And then the next thing is, so first of all, can they tell the difference between all of the different things? And then is it becoming less frequent that they make those mistakes? Are they improving, or is this sort of still an ongoing issue? And one thing you can do too with this is, if we think about kindergarten, we're not just writing D's and B's on pieces of paper over and over again. We're writing it in sand, we're writing it big on the board, we're writing it on the tables with markers. We're writing it in tons of different ways, both with small motor movements and those big gross motor movements. So we can look at those and work on them in more what are called multi-sensory ways, and then see if that impacts as well. So that's kind of to say that those reversals at that age might be normal. But then if you kind of step back and think about, have you seen any of those other signs before? Are you still seeing those signs? Are they really struggling to, if I say cat, can they put it together and make cat? Can they break it apart? And then we also kind of need to think about all the bigger pieces that go into reading. So, obviously dyslexia, is a thing, but there are many other reasons why they might be struggling to learn to read. Eyesight is one of them. So I definitely encourage all parents to have their kids get an eye test, and not just the regular, can they see the letters on the page, but to work with an occupational optometrist or a developmental optometrist to do tracking, to do visual perception. Do they have any of those issues? Because tracking could be a big part of it, or that visual perception where their vision, they just don't see the difference. And then there is vision therapy that can be done for that as well. The other thing would be, then there's the physical side of it. Are they struggling to hold the pencil? Are they struggling to make those fine motor movements? That could be the other side. So there are many different pieces as to why they might be struggling to learn to read. You just kind of want to look at the signs. But the big thing is to kind of, out of all of that, really is that rate of progress. Because a lot of these issues are totally normal, but if they continue for too long, then that's not normal. Yeah, I think that was all the questions that have come in, either previously or in the chat. Does anybody have any other questions at this point? All right, so thank you all so much for joining us. And just to, let me put this up one more time. Yeah, so thank you all so much for joining us. Of course, if you have any other questions, you can reach out to the admin team at info@bnb.edu.hk down there at the bottom. You can join our website, follow us on social media. And then, of course, if you're interested in any of our spring or summer classes, those can be one-on-one or those small group classes. You can use the QR code to find out more. And if you have a question that you think of later, definitely email the team and they can help you. So thank you all so much for joining us today, and have a wonderful rest of your weekend.